"Move along, sweetheart. This scene is for professionals," he said it loud enough for every officer on that sidewalk to hear. Loud enough for the paramedics crouched over the body to look up. Loud enough for the woman holding the small, worn leather satchel to feel it land the way it was meant to, like a hand pressed flat against her chest, pushing her back toward the curb, back toward the ordinary world where people like her were supposed to stay put and wait to be told what to do. She didn't move. She looked at him. Officer Dale Whitmore, badge number 1147, 17 years on the force, third-generation law enforcement. A man who had never once in his career been told he was wrong, and she looked at him with eyes so still they could have been carved from stone. She said, quietly, "I need to get through." He laughed. An actual laugh. Short, dismissive, the kind of sound a man makes when he's not just turning someone away, but performing the turning away for an audience, making a point to everyone watching that he can, that he will, that it costs him nothing. Nobody on that sidewalk said a word. Nobody moved. 23 officers, 4 paramedics, 2 crime scene technicians, and 1 deputy fire chief, all of them inside that yellow perimeter, and not one of them spoke. He had no idea who she was. He had no idea what was already in motion. And inside that building, on a gurney behind a curtain, a man's heart was doing something no one in that hallway yet understood, and in 11 minutes, that man was going to open his eyes and say one word: her name. Have you ever been turned away from somewhere you had every right to be, just because of the way you looked? Have you ever stood at a door that was locked for no reason except someone's assumption about who you were? Let me take you back to 6 hours before Officer Whitmore made the worst professional decision of his life. The alarm on Dr. Cecilia Mays's phone went off at 4:47 every morning. Not 4:45, not 5, 4:47. She had said it that way 22 years ago, during her residency at Harlem Hospital, and she had never once changed it. Her daughter used to ask her why such an odd number, and Cecilia would say the same thing every time. Because 4:47 is nobody else's time. It belongs to me. She lived on the second floor of a narrow brownstone on West 119th Street, a building she owned outright. A building her mother had cleaned offices for 12 years to help make a down payment on. Back in 1989, back when the neighborhood was still in the long shadow of a crack epidemic, and the banks that were supposed to serve it were nowhere to be found. The building didn't look like much from the outside. Brown paint on the exterior door, slightly chipped at the corners. A front stoop where Mr. Freeman from 3B left his folding chair on warm evenings. The same chair for 11 years now, weathered to the point where it was less a chair than a fixture, like a tree that had decided that particular square of concrete was home. A rusted mailbox that Cecilia had meant to replace for 2 years running and had made her peace with not replacing, because some things stay not because you've forgotten them, but because fixing them would feel like erasing something. Inside was different. Inside smelled like cardamom and cedar, like books left open on a table with a finger still in the pages, like the particular quiet that belongs only to people who have learned to treat silence as a resource rather than an absence. She made her coffee the same way every morning. Same ceramic press her mother had given her the day she matched into her residency program, a Tuesday in March, gray outside, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself. Her mother had pressed the coffee maker into her hands at the kitchen table, both of them crying a little and pretending not to, and she had said, "You are going to need good coffee and a hard head. I cannot give you the head. That one's already yours." And then she'd smiled, that particular smile, the one Cecilia's patients sometimes caught a glimpse of, because it lived somewhere in Cecilia's face too, a smile that said, "I see you, and I am not afraid of what I see, and I love you anyway, all at once, without the commas." Her mother, Gloria Mays, had died 4 years ago. Stage 4, ovarian cancer. Fast, with a cruelty that did not allow for anything except the stripping away of everything that wasn't essential. Cecilia had been her primary advocate through every specialist, every treatment decision, every conversation in which a well-meaning physician used words that were technically accurate but functionally useless. She had sat in those rooms not as a physician, not as someone who held a credential that should have made these conversations easier, but as a daughter, and she had felt, for the first time in her professional life, the full weight of what her patients carried into her office. That experience had changed how she practiced medicine, not cosmetically, not in the ways that get mentioned in annual performance reviews, permanently, fundamentally, at the level where belief lives. She kept one thing, of her mother's on her desk at the hospital, not a photograph. A small brass compass antique, perfectly round, with a cracked crystal face and an inscription on the back that Cecilia had memorized before she was old enough to understand it. North is where you already are. G.M. Nobody knew what it meant. Gloria Mays had never explained it. The explanation was not the point of it. Cecilia had stopped trying to decode the words and had simply accepted them as the kind of wisdom that doesn't owe you a translation, that sits with you and does its work in the background, the way the best things do. She kept it in the front pocket of her leather satchel, the worn brown one, the one she had carried since medical school, soft now in a way that new leather is not, shaped by years to the particular things she put in it. The kind of bag that people glanced at and classified without thinking: rummage sale, thrift store, hand-me-down, and moved on. Not because it was ugly, because it was quiet, because it did not announce itself. Dr. Cecilia Mays was 49 years old. She had a medical degree from Columbia, a fellowship from Johns Hopkins, and 22 years as a trauma physician that had made her one of 11 physicians in the country, certified in a subspecialty so narrow and so specific that most emergency departments in the country called her directly, by name, when they had a case no one else knew how to manage. She was the attending physician of record at St. Catherine's Medical Center in Upper Manhattan. She was also, as of 8 months earlier, the newly appointed chief of emergency medicine, a role she had been offered twice before by 2 other institutions and had twice declined, because the conditions weren't right and she knew the difference between a title and an opportunity. She was, to the untrained eye, a black woman in her late 40s, standing on a sidewalk in scrubs and a long cardigan, holding a satchel that had seen better decades. That was all Officer Whitmore saw. She had received the call at 6:12 that morning. Her second coffee was half finished. The city was still in the gray hour before full light, when the streets belong to delivery trucks and early joggers, and the people whose jobs require them to already be somewhere before the rest of the world has decided to begin. A man had been found unresponsive at a commercial property on Amsterdam Avenue, 6 blocks north of the hospital. Blunt force trauma to the head. Paramedics on scene. Vitals unstable in a way the on-scene medics were struggling to characterize. The detail that made this call different, the detail that made Cecilia set down her coffee and pick up her satchel, was the last part. The detective on scene, a woman named Lieutenant Carmen Torres, had looked at the victim and recognized something. Not the man. Something about the presentation, the specific pattern of how his body was responding to the injury, the way the numbers didn't quite line up with the clinical picture in front of her. And she had called the hospital, asked for whoever knew about head trauma, and the hospital had called Cecilia, because 6 weeks earlier, Cecilia had published a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. 43 pages, written over 18 months, describing a rare and systematically misdiagnosed intracranial pressure response to a specific form of closed head trauma. A pattern that looked, on every standard assessment, like irreversible neurological shutdown. A pattern that mimicked brain death closely enough that it had fooled trained professionals, good ones, in 17 of the 22 cases she had documented. A pattern that was, in the specific circumstances she had identified, reversible. The paper had a specific phrase at its center. She had written it in the introduction, and she had argued with her co-author about it for 3 weeks because it was not technically precise in the way medical journal language is supposed to be precise. But it was true, and the co-author had eventually agreed. The appearance of absence. That was the phrase. A state that looks like the end of something but isn't. The paramedics on scene at Amsterdam Avenue had the paper pulled up on a phone. They had been waiting for her for 19 minutes. That was the room Officer Whitmore was keeping her out of. She had driven from the hospital in 7 minutes, which meant 6 blocks, and 2 red lights, and 1 conversation with herself in the car that she would never repeat to anyone. She had her credentials on a lanyard around her neck, the St. Catherine's badge with her name and photograph, the same badge that got her through 17 different hospital security checkpoints on a daily basis. She had called ahead. She had done every single professional thing that a physician arriving at an emergency scene is supposed to do, and she was standing on the wrong side of a strip of yellow tape because a man with a badge and a cold laugh had looked at her in the 3 seconds it takes to make the kind of assumption that ruins things, and decided, on no evidence, that she did not belong here. Dale Whitmore had grown up in a law enforcement family in a way that is both ordinary and, when you look closely at it, a complete explanation. His grandfather had been on the force. His father had been on the force. His uncle had retired after 30 years as a precinct captain in a part of Staten Island where, as Whitmore would say when he felt comfortable enough to say it, things ran right. He had never failed any required training. He had never received a formal disciplinary action that had survived the paperwork. He had never been told, in any language he was forced to take seriously, that he was wrong. He was a man who understood authority as something that flowed in a direction, down, from the people with credentials and jurisdiction to the people without, from the people in uniform to the people on the sidewalk, from the people who decided things to the people who were decided about. This understanding was not malicious, exactly, in the way that the most dangerous understandings rarely are. It was just the shape of the world, the way he had been taught to read a scene quickly, with confidence, and with a certainty in his own judgment that had never once in 17 years been meaningfully corrected. He was also a man who had been having a rough month in a way that had sharpened something in him that probably didn't need to be sharper. His captain had written him up 3 weeks prior. The letter in his file was careful, procedural, the kind of language that institutional documents use when they want to document something without quite saying what the something is. 3 excessive force complaints in 18 months. Each one reviewed, each one resolved. No further action. But the third one had produced the written notice. And the written notice had produced in Whitmore a particular quality of irritation, the irritation of a man who has been told he needs to be more careful without being told what careful means. Because careful in that context did not mean change, it meant documentation, and those are not the same thing. He had arrived at the Amsterdam Avenue scene at 6:51. He had taken one look at the perimeter, at the sidewalk crowd that always materializes around yellow tape, and he had planted himself at the nearest entry point the way he always did, with the particular authority of a man who believes the space he occupies is improved by his occupying it. And then a woman with a leather satchel and a hospital lanyard had walked up and said she needed to get through. He had done what he always did. He had read the scene. He had read her. He had made his decision in the half-second before she finished the sentence. Move along, sweetheart. This scene is for professionals. What happened next happened in the order that things happen when they are, in retrospect, already decided when the outcome is fixed, and the middle is just the machinery of arriving there. She held up her ID badge, the St. Catherine's Medical Center badge, with her name and her title printed in the clear block letters that hospital credentialing departments use so that there is no ambiguity, so that the information is legible at a distance, so that there is literally no reason to misread it. Dr. Cecilia Mays, Chief of Emergency Medicine. He glanced at it, one glance. The kind of glance that is not actually a glance, but a performance of one, the motion of looking without the act of seeing. That doesn't give you clearance here, he said. We have a medical examiner. The victim isn't dead, she said. Not yet, he said, and something crossed his face. Then not cruelty exactly, more the ease of cruelty. The unthinking comfort of a man who has said things like this before and has never faced a consequence for them. That's what the ME is for. She did not raise her voice. She kept it at the same register she used when she was talking to a patient's family in a room where the news was bad. Steady, exact, without a crack in it. She said, "Officer, I have been specifically requested at this scene by the detective in charge of the investigation. I have a patient inside that building who may be experiencing a form of intracranial hemorrhage that presents as neurological non-response and is frequently and fatally misdiagnosed as brain death. I need to get through that door. Every minute matters." He stepped closer. Not a lunge, not a grab, just a step. The kind of step that men in authority take when they want to remind you that their body is also an argument. Close enough to make the point. Close enough that his voice, when he lowered it, was still perfectly audible to every person in a 15-foot radius. "Lady," he said, "I don't know what kind of doctor you think you are, but around here, we follow a chain of command, and you are not in it." He reached out then, not striking, not seizing just the flat of his hand, a dismissive movement, the gesture you make to push something you've already decided is irrelevant out of the path you're trying to walk. His hand connected with the flap of her satchel. The satchel swung on her shoulder. The front pocket, the one that was never quite fully closed because she had never gotten around to replacing the small clasp that had broken 2 years ago, came open. The compass fell. It hit the sidewalk concrete at an angle. A small, terrible sound, sharp and final, like a period at the end of a sentence that was already over. The crystal face, cracked before it landed, shattered on impact. Not dramatically, not in a cascade of gleaming pieces. Just quietly, into 4 sections that spread less than 2 inches apart, the compass needle spinning free, the brass body lying on the dirty concrete with the inscription facing up. North is where you already are. She looked down at it. She looked at it for 3 seconds, which is longer than you think. Then she looked up at him. She still did not raise her voice. "I'm going to need you to remember this moment," she said. All of it. He didn't know what that meant. He was going to. What he didn't know, what was already in motion, had been in motion for the past 4 minutes, was that Detective Lieutenant Carmen Torres had been standing at the glass panel in the entrance door, watching. She had seen the badge. She had seen the satchel. She had heard the word sweetheart from 40 feet away through a pane of glass. She had already made 2 phone calls. And one of the paramedics stationed near the entrance, a man named Marcus Webb, who had been doing this job for 14 years, and who had the particular instincts of someone who has seen enough to understand what a moment is, had turned on his body camera at the 60-second mark of the interaction and had not turned it off. And the man on the gurney, 22 feet away, behind a curtain in the lobby staging area, had just moved his left hand. 3 minutes. That was what was left of the window Cecilia's paper described. 3 minutes between the movement she would know how to read, and the point at which the window closed. Torres did not knock. She pushed the door open and came through it at the walk of a woman who has spent 15 years making decisions in the seconds available to make them. Whitmore, not loud. The kind of voice that doesn't need to be loud because it has never needed to be. He turned. "Step aside," she said. "Detective, this individual does not have documented step aside." And then to Cecilia, without a pause, without the beat of transition that would have cost time. "Doctor, please." Cecilia was already moving. She bent and gathered the pieces of the compass in her palm, all 4 pieces, and the spinning needle, closed her hand around them, and she walked through the tape without looking at Whitmore again. Behind her, the body camera ran. The sidewalk was silent. 23 officers, 2 crime scene technicians, 1 deputy fire chief. Not one of them said a word. The door opened and then closed. Inside, the clock had 11 minutes left. She would tell residents, later, not this story specifically, but the shape of it, that the best thing you can do in a clinical emergency is to get boring as fast as possible. Not calm, exactly, though calm is part of it. Boring, procedural. The moment you are boring is the moment the room stops performing around you and starts working. She had a gift for this. It was the thing her attendings had written about during her fellowship, the thing the evaluation forms reached for and couldn't quite name, the ability to walk into a chaotic room and make it functional not through force but through absolute clarity of focus, the way a tuning fork makes chaos harmonize just by being exactly itself. She asked for what she needed. She got it. She did what the paper described. She did it without narrating it, without explaining it to the room, without the commentary that fear sometimes produces in people who are afraid of being wrong. She knew she wasn't wrong. She had been in this room before, not this room, this situation, this particular convergence of physiology and timing and irreversibility twice, once during her fellowship, once 3 years before the paper. She had been wrong the first time, and the wrongness of it had lived in her since then as a specific, calibrating weight. The kind of weight that makes you more careful, not less brave. 7 minutes. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when everyone in them has understood that something important is happening that is not yet finished. No one spoke, except to respond to a direct request. The paramedics moved when she asked them to move. The equipment was where it was supposed to be. And then, Arthur Beaumont opened his eyes. Not gradually. Not the slow surfacing that movies show. The flickering, the confused emergence. All at once, eyes open and present, the way a man who has been somewhere returns to where he left. And the first thing his mouth formed before orientation, before pain, before the 10,000 questions that should logically have preceded everything else was a sound. A name. Cecilia. The paramedic nearest to him went completely still. Torres, standing 6 feet from the gurney, said very quietly, "What?" Arthur Beaumont looked at the ceiling tiles. His voice was slow and rough, pulled up through several feet of distance, but it was clear, unmistakably clear. "Cecilia Mays," he said. "Is she here?" Every person in that room looked at the woman in the cardigan. Cecilia stepped closer. She put her hand over his. "Mr. Beaumont," she said. "I'm here." He turned his head. The confusion in his eyes was present but not total, the confusion of geography, of time, not the confusion of self. He looked at her face with the focus of someone locating a landmark they have been looking for. "I know your father," he said. The room did not move. "I taught with him. Summer program, 62, 63. He used to talk about his daughter, said she was going to be a doctor, and God help anyone who tried to tell her otherwise." Cecilia did not speak for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. Then she said, "He was right." The question of who Dr. Robert Mays was deserves more than a footnote. He deserves the story. He had graduated from Howard University College of Medicine in 1961, one of 23 black students in a program that, in the years prior to his enrollment, had accepted significantly fewer. He had done his clinical rotations with a precision that his supervisors noted and then, because the times were what they were, did not advocate for in the ways that might have mattered. He had applied for hospital privileges at 7 institutions in New York City upon graduation. He received 6 rejections. The language of the rejection letters was careful understaffed at present, positions filled. The review committee met and considered the language of exclusion that has always known how to wear professional clothes. The 7th hospital was a community hospital in Harlem, underfunded, understaffed in the ways that matter, serving the patients that every other institution had found, through one mechanism or another, a reason not to. He had walked in on a Monday morning in October of 1961, and he had never left. Not that hospital, not that neighborhood, not that commitment. 31 years. He had seen things change and had been part of the changing. He had trained residents who trained residents. He had sat on 100 committees. He had watched the city remake itself around him and had himself remade small parts of it, in the quiet ways that accumulate over decades into something you can point to. He had died the spring before Cecilia graduated from medical school. Pancreatic cancer, which is a diagnosis that arrives and then moves very quickly toward its own conclusion. 6 weeks from the scan to the end. She had been in her 3rd year. She had flown home when he called, and she had not gone back to school for 10 days. And when she did go back, her professors were careful with her in the way that people are careful when they have recognized something in a student that is not academic. On the 4th day at his bedside, he had done something she hadn't expected. He had reached into the nightstand drawer, not asked for help reaching, just reached and taken out the compass. The same one his mother had given him, he told her. The morning he'd walked into that Harlem hospital, his first day of privileges. 29 years old and convinced, in the way that competent people are sometimes convinced in their worst moments, that he was going to fail in front of everyone. He turned it over in his hand. The cracked face it had cracked years before, in a fall from his pocket onto a tile floor. And he had never replaced the crystal because the crack didn't affect the needle. The inscription, "North is where you already are." "I never understood it," he told her. 50 years. Never understood what she meant. He held it out to her. "But I carried it every single day, and I never got lost." She had carried it since the morning of the day he died. She had put it in the front pocket of the satchel she was using then, and it had been in every front pocket of every satchel since. The satchels changed when they wore out. The compass did not change. Now the 4 pieces of it were in her closed left hand as she stood in a lobby on Amsterdam Avenue, and she did not have time to think about what had happened outside on the sidewalk, and she didn't try to. Later, there would be time. Later, the whole shape of the morning would become clear, and she would sit with it and decide what she was going to do. Right now, there was a man on a gurney in a window and her hands needed to be free. 3 hours after that, Officer Dale Whitmore was sitting in a room he had never sat in before, on the wrong side of a table, in an internal affairs interview suite on the 14th floor of One Police Plaza, with his union representative to his left and a lieutenant from the Civilian Complaint Review Board across from him, and a departmental supervisor at the far end of the table who had not yet spoken and whose silence was doing more work than anyone else's words. On the table between them was a tablet. On the tablet was 47 seconds of video. It was body camera footage from paramedic Marcus Webb. The image quality was what body cameras produce: functional, undramatic, with the particular flattening that happens when a lens renders something real. But it was clear. Everything was clear. Cecilia's ID badge, held up at eye level. The full credential, unmistakable. Whitmore's face as he glanced at it. The step forward. The hand movement. The satchel swinging. The compass falling. The sound of the crystal shattering even through the small microphone on the camera. You could hear it. And then Cecilia's face, in the moment after. Not angry. Not crumbling. Just still. The way a door is still when it is closed. And her voice, saying, "I'm going to need you to remember this moment. All of it." The tablet was paused on the image of the compass on the sidewalk. The inscription wasn't legible at that angle, but you could see the 4 pieces, and you could see what it was. The IA lieutenant said, "Officer Whitmore, walk me through your decision-making from the point of first contact with Dr. Mays." He looked at his union rep. His union rep looked at the tablet. The departmental supervisor at the end of the table still hadn't spoken. Nobody said anything for 11 seconds. What Whitmore did not know, sitting in that room, was the full scope of what was already moving. Webb's body camera was one recording. A second camera, a fixed surveillance unit mounted above the building's entrance, had captured the entire interaction from a different angle, including the moment the compass fell, and a tight enough frame to show Whitmore's expression in the moment after it fell. That expression was the one that lawyers would later describe, with professional understatement, as consequential. And those were only the 2 cameras that law enforcement controlled. 7 civilians on that sidewalk had taken out their phones during the interaction. 7 separate recordings, from 7 different angles, with the particular uncoordinated spontaneity that means no one can later claim the footage was staged or selected. An officer, 20 feet away. A crime scene tech. A civilian bystander who happened to be early for a job across the street. A woman walking a dog who stopped walking the dog and took out her phone with the practiced speed of someone who has learned to document things. 7 perspectives on the same 47 seconds. By 8:30 that morning, the first clip was online. Not posted by a journalist, not by an advocacy organization with a communications strategy, by a 34-year-old woman named Denise, the dog walker, who captioned it with a single sentence. She had her badge out the whole time. By 9 o'clock, 3 separate clips were circulating. By 11, the combined views across platforms were approaching 250,000. By 1 in the afternoon, a teenage boy in the Bronx named Isaiah, 16 years old, honor student, son of a physician, posted the clearest clip with a caption that became the caption, the one every subsequent post pulled from, the one that got quoted in print. He called her sweetheart. She called the code. The patient lived. 3 million views by end of day. The name of the font on his phone's video caption became briefly famous in a way that font names never become famous. St. Catherine's Medical Center's communications department was, in the kindest possible terms, not prepared. They had a media protocol for data breaches and a media protocol for malpractice allegations and a general protocol for sensitive personnel matters. And none of those protocols had a scenario in which their chief of emergency medicine saves a patient who had been nearly abandoned and simultaneously becomes the subject of 7 million views of video documentation of a police officer blocking her from the scene. They sent an email, then another, then a third, that contradicted the second. And then someone, a communications officer named Patricia, who had been in the role for 11 months and would be promoted inside the year, made the call that turned out to be the right one. She picked up the phone. She called Cecilia, and she said, "Do you want to speak? If you do, we'll support it. If you don't, we'll handle it. But I think it should be your choice." Cecilia had said yes. One statement. She gave it the next morning, standing outside the hospital's main entrance, in the same cardigan, with the same satchel. She did not use the words outraged or humiliated or victimized. She did not perform anything. She said, "A man is alive today because a detective trusted her instincts and opened a door. The patient deserves that outcome. That's the whole story as far as I'm concerned." It was a masterclass in saying everything while appearing to say very little. The hashtag accumulated 140,000 posts in the next 18 hours. The department's formal response was announced 72 hours after the incident. The investigation had begun, internally, within the first 24, before the announcement, before the press conference, because the commissioner had watched the footage herself at 7:30 on the morning after it surfaced and had made several phone calls before 8. The formal investigation interviewed 31 witnesses. It reviewed 7 civilian recordings, 2 institutional recordings, 1 piece of dashcam footage from a patrol vehicle parked on the far side of Amsterdam that no one had initially logged. It reviewed Officer Whitmore's complete personnel file, which required 2 supervisory sign-offs to access in full, and which contained in the sections that those sign-offs unlocked the record of 3 prior excessive force complaints, all reviewed, all resolved, all marked, no further action. 2 of the 3 involved incidents in which credentialed medical or social service professionals had been prevented from accessing scenes. The pattern was not hidden, it was documented. The documentation had been careful and complete, and had produced no consequence. The report was 112 pages. The police commissioner read it over a weekend. On Monday morning, she announced a press conference. She read selected findings aloud. She did not editorialize. She did not have to. Officer Whitmore was terminated. Not suspended with pay pending review. Not placed in a desk reassignment. Terminated. Effective the date of the announcement. His pension calculation subject to a separate administrative process that his attorneys immediately began contesting. He turned in his badge on a Thursday afternoon in a room with no press and no cameras and, as far as anyone on the outside could determine, no ceremony at all. The 3 officers who had stood on that sidewalk and said nothing received formal reprimands and were enrolled in mandatory retraining. Their silence was noted in their files in language that was, for departmental language, unusually specific about what silence in that context meant. The policy governing medical professional access to crime scenes was pulled and rewritten. The existing policy had been vague in the way that policies become vague when no one with authority has ever felt the consequences of the vagueness. The new version named specific protocols. It named liaison contacts at 11 medical institutions in the borough. It established a verification procedure that took 30 seconds. And it added, in a section that had not previously existed, a clause specifying that credential verification was the duty of the supervising officer at the scene, not the responsibility of the professional requesting access. The burden, in other words, was redistributed. It went to the person with the badge. The policy change was small. The implications of it were not. Cecilia's attorneys filed the civil rights claim 9 days after the incident. The city's legal office had the same 112-page report that the commissioner had read, and it took them 11 days to communicate that they would not be contesting liability. The negotiations that followed were not fast. They were thorough. Cecilia participated in them with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, not urgency, not heat, but precision. She had been clear with her attorneys from the first meeting about what she wanted the outcome to look like. The settlement was reached 6 months after the incident. The financial terms were not large by the standards of civil litigation, and Cecilia had not asked them to be. What she had asked for was something the city's attorneys had taken 3 full drafts to agree to. A public acknowledgement, in writing, signed by the police commissioner and the mayor's legal counsel. 4 paragraphs, 37 sentences, filed as a public document, stating, without euphemism, that Dr. Cecilia Mays had been wrongfully denied access to a patient, that a man had nearly died as a direct result, that the word sweetheart, in the context in which it had been used, was not a neutral descriptor, that the interaction had not been an isolated error in judgment but a pattern, and that the institution recognized the pattern and named it, and would not seal that naming behind confidentiality language. She had not wanted the money. She had wanted the words, and she had gotten them. Every sentence mattered. She read them all. Arthur Beaumont spent 9 days in the hospital, the first 4 in Cecilia's unit, the remaining 5 in general neurology, as his recovery moved faster than anyone's conservative projections had allowed for. He was, his neurologist said privately and then publicly when asked, a genuinely remarkable patient, not because of anything he did, but because of what his brain did, which was respond to the intervention with a speed and completeness that illustrated exactly what Cecilia's paper had been arguing for 2 years. He went home on a Sunday. His daughter was there. Two of his former students were there, men in their 40s now, with children of their own, men who had been mathematics students of Arthur Beaumont's and who had driven to the hospital from the Bronx and from New Jersey when they heard what happened and had not left until he was discharged. He gave one interview. A magazine had been doing a piece on Cecilia and had, with her permission, reached out to him. He sat in the interview the way a man sits when he has agreed to tell the truth and understands that truth does not require drama. He said he remembered almost nothing of that morning. The stairs, the sound of footsteps that were not his, and then light. He had been, he told the interviewer, somewhere that was not here, not painfully, not fearfully, just elsewhere, and then he had come back. And the first thing that had surfaced, before his name, before where he was, before anything of the ordinary inventory of consciousness, was her name. He had known about Cecilia Mays for over 60 years. He had heard about her before she existed, heard about the daughter Dr. Robert Mays was planning on having someday, who was going to be a doctor, who was going to be extraordinary. He had read her paper in the New England Journal the month it was published. He had thought, closing it, that Robert Mays would have read every word. He sent her a card when he was discharged, handwritten, in the careful cursive of a man who had spent 4 decades teaching young people that precision was respect. It said, "The compass knows north because north is real, not because the compass decides. Thank you for knowing where you were going." She had it framed. She hung it in her office, to the left of the window, where she could see it from her desk without turning toward it, which meant she saw it constantly without choosing to, which meant it did what the best things do. It settled into the background and worked. The foundation did not have a name for 3 months. This was intentional. Cecilia had been approached, in the weeks after the incident, by more organizations and advisors and well-meaning institutional representatives than she could track, all of them with frameworks and suggestions and, occasionally, very beautiful letterhead. She had listened to all of them. She had accepted the help that was structural, and the money that came without conditions, and the introductions that connected her with people who understood how to build something that lasts. And she had been clear, from the beginning, about what the thing was for. Not visibility, not commemoration, not the rehabilitation of anything, including her own story. The foundation existed to do one specific thing: fund emergency medicine residency positions for physicians from communities that had been historically underrepresented in academic medicine, not because of lack of talent or preparation or commitment, but because the pathways into those positions had been, for decades, systematically narrowed. Not scholarships, positions. Paid, credentialed, mentored positions inside institutions that had the resources and the commitment to make them real. The first 3 positions were named in a small ceremony in the foundation's first year, not after Cecilia. She had been specific about this in a way that her board initially pushed back on and then, when they understood the reasoning, stopped pushing. The first position bore the name of Dr. Robert Mays. The second bore the name of Gloria Mays. The third, and this was the one that required a phone call she had made herself, sitting in her office with the door closed on a Wednesday afternoon in March, bore the name of Arthur Beaumont. He had cried. She had not, quite. She had said, "You kept going." He had said, "So did you." She had said, "I had a compass." The compass had been repaired. A watchmaker on 125th Street, a small shop, 1 room, a sign in the window, handwritten on a piece of cardboard that said, in letters slightly uneven in a way that felt personal rather than careless, had spent 2 hours on it. He had replaced the crystal face with one cut slightly thinner than the original, so that the light came through it differently now, and so that you could feel, if you ran your thumb across it, a faint bevel at the edge where the new crystal met the brass housing, the trace of a break, mended but not hidden. He did not charge her. She had asked him why. He had said, "My daughter's a nurse. I know what it is when they don't let you in." She had thanked him. She had meant it. The compass went back into the front pocket of her satchel the morning the foundation held its first orientation session for the 3 new residents. She did not mention it in her remarks. She stood at the front of a conference room in St. Catharines and looked at 3 young physicians and said to them the truest thing she knew. She said, "You belong here. Not because someone decided to let you in, because you are already here. That's the whole thing. That's the whole lesson. North is where you already are. The rest is just the work." And then she got to the work. If this story landed on you in some way, if something in it made you go quiet, or made you think of a door that was shut in your face when you had every right to walk through it, take a second before you go. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had someone look at you in the first half second and decide you didn't belong somewhere you absolutely did? What happened? What did you do? I want to read every single one. Here's what really gets me when I sit with this whole story. It isn't the settlement, though the settlement mattered. It isn't even the footage, though the footage is remarkable for everything it captured and everything it made impossible to deny. It's the compass. Think about what that object actually is. It's a piece of brass with a cracked face and an inscription that nobody in 3 generations fully understood, passed from a grandmother to a son to a daughter, carried through medical school and residency, and 49 years of a life that was built entirely on the belief that you keep going north, even when no one will tell you where north is. It has no monetary value. It has every other kind. And a man whose entire career was built on the principle that he got to decide who belonged where reached out and knocked it to the ground. He didn't know what it was. That's the thing that stays with me. He saw something in his way, and he moved it. He didn't know it was carrying 60 years of a family's will. He didn't know it was the inheritance of a doctor who'd been turned away from 6 hospitals. He didn't know that the woman holding it had sat with her dying father and heard him say, "I never got lost." He didn't know any of it. He just reached out and moved it. And she picked up the pieces, put them in her hand, walked through the door, saved a man's life. The watchmaker said it better than I could. He said, "I know what it is when they don't let you in." There's a version of this story where what matters most is the accountability, the termination, the policy change, the signed statement, the 37 sentences, and those things do matter. They matter more than people sometimes admit, because the specific detail of accountability is what the people who come after you can point to and say, "This was named, this was not sealed, this was not managed into silence." That matters enormously. But underneath all of it, the thing that stays, the thing I think you'll carry from this, is not the consequence. It's the moment before the consequence. It's the woman on the sidewalk, looking down at the broken compass and then looking up, not angry, not afraid, just still, and saying, quietly, to a man who had no idea what he was dealing with, "I'm going to need you to remember this moment." Here's what I want to leave you with, and I want you to actually sit with it before you scroll on. Is there a door you've been standing outside of not because you don't belong there, but because someone, at some point, told you convincingly enough that you didn't? Is there a compass you put down? Is there something you stopped carrying because a voice, from outside or inside, said, "Step back, not you, not here, this scene is for professionals"? Doctor. Cecilia Mays picked up the compass in pieces. She didn't wait until it was whole. She held the broken thing in her hand, and she walked through the door the moment the door opened. North is where you already are. What's your compass? Are you still carrying it?